Good afternoon. I'm David Preshous. I've lived in Lytham, the next door village, for 47 years, and I was headmaster of the County High School Community College in Bishop's Castle from 1973 to 1997. I've been dipping into the history of the Bishop's Castle area for a good many years, and I was one of the editors of the book, The Story of Bishop's Castle, which came out in 2016. I'm president of the Southwest Shropshire Historical and Archaeological Society, SWSHAS, which is probably why I'm here this afternoon. So, Georgian politics and rotten boroughs. Queen Anne was victorious by land and by sea, and then came the Georges, 1, 2 and 3. The fourth of the Georges at art had a fling, but Willie IV was a sailor king. Yet barring all pother, the one and the other were all of them kings in their time. That's the chapter of Kings, a popular song written and sung by Mr. Collins around 1785, and it had extra verses added as time went by. 4 Georges then, from 1714 to 1830, and William IV from 1830 to 1837. These were the Hanoverian kings who ruled for 123 years. But to understand the politics of Bishop's Castle, we need to go back some way beyond them. And I want at this point to pay tribute right away to the most meticulous research carried out on this subject over many years by another George Bohr, one of our most eminent Shropshire historians. And if you're watching, George, thank you very much. Bishop's Castle history can be loosely divided into 3 phases. First, from its foundation in the 12th century until the 15th century, as a border town of tactical importance, with a castle guarding the wealthy agricultural land of the bishops of Hereford against incursions from Wales and elsewhere. Then, after receiving its charter of incorporation from Elizabeth I in 1573, as a borough with some political significance and considerable notoriety. And finally, after the Reform Act of 1832, as a small but vigorous social and economic centre of a large and sparsely populated area, which is how we like to describe ourselves today. In 1584, following the granting by Queen Elizabeth I of a Charter of Incorporation in 1573, and further legislation, Bishop's Castle found itself with the right to return 2 members of Parliament. The first 2 were Thomas Jukes and John Cole, who were locally well connected in that they were both married to nieces of Edmund Plowden of London Hall, one of the town's original chief burgesses, and who may possibly have influenced Queen Elizabeth in granting this very small town its charter. The enfranchisement of Bishop's Castle gave voting powers to its burgesses. How many of these were there at any given time? The number seems to have risen from about 40 in 1584 to around 170 in 1802, and ultimately perhaps as many as 200. Local historian Frank Lavender suggested that qualification was generally by birthright, gift, purchase, or ownership of property, admission to the freedom of the borough, or on apprenticeship. In 1713, 2 men were accepted on payment of £5 each to the Town Hall Repair Fund. Burgesses did not always need to be resident. Suffice to say that for about 250 years, less than 200 Bishop's Castle men elected 2 members to our national parliament. In the middle of the 18th century, Shropshire returned 2 members of parliament for the county, not subject to election and both firmly in the grasp of the Tories. In the county's 5 parliamentary boroughs, candidacy was always also controlled by the most powerful local families. In Shrewsbury and Ludlow, by Lord Powys. In Bridgenorth, by the Whitmores of Apley Park. In Much Wenlock, by the Foresters of Willey Hall. And in Bishop's Castle, by the Walcotts of Walcott Hall, Ledbury North. For much of the early 17th century, Bishop's Castle was represented in Parliament by pairs of wealthy landowners sharing the positions among themselves in a fairly standard pattern. These included Edmund Plowden of Plowden, Richard Oakley of Oakley, that's Lytham, William Blunden of Blunden Hall, Richard Moore of Linley, John Corbett of Halston in North Shropshire, Walter Waring of Oldbury, the little village of Sned, Richard Harley of Brampton Bryan, John Walcott of Walcott Hall, Lidbury North, and a little later, Robert Clive, also of Walcott. Local men who won election, we know the names of Eze Thomas, town clerk, and the infamous Mason family, father and son, Richard and Charles, of whom a bit more later. The Oakleys of Oakley, later Lytham Manor, are particularly interesting. There are fine monuments in the transept to Bishop's Castle Church to William Herbert Dyer, died 1821, husband of Mary Oakley, to Herbert Oakley, died 1830, and John Oakley, 1744 to 1811. And he was known in the family as the Old Retriever. I'm assured it was because of his actions, not his appearance. He has a splendidly warm accolade on his monument. And more recently and surprisingly, in 2010, a vault was discovered beneath the floor of the sanctuary containing 17 Oakley family coffins. During the reign of Charles II, there arose a controversy as to whether the king's brother, James, Duke of York, should be excluded from the succession because of his conversion to Roman Catholicism. Between 1679 and 1681, there were 3 exclusion parliaments. 2 political parties emerged, the Tories who supported James and the Whigs who opposed him. A consequence of this was that even in local elections like those in Bishop's Castle, party alliances became a factor for election. Simply being a local landowner was no longer adequate in itself. From 1698, when Charles Mason was elected with Richard Moore, cash became the unum necessarium, the one essential for election success. Charles, who was a singularly unprincipled man, dominated the scene, allying himself with the Earl of Macclesfield, and bribery became a standard procedure for both candidates and burgesses. The price of a vote rising as high as £40 or £50. Periodically, petitions were made in Parliament by losing candidates, and the House of Commons might then intervene to unseat the victors. This, however, didn't change the overall practice of wholesale corruption. Between 1695 and 1727, Charles Mason was elected to the borough 8 times, unseated 3 times, and once successfully unseating another candidate even less principled than himself. That was Bowater Vernon in 1726. On that celebrated occasion, Mason was able to show that 51 of the 52 people who had voted for Vernon had received bribes. The rate had been £12 per voter, with 1 guinea for each of the wives, making a total expenditure on Vernon's part of over £600. Mason's petition was upheld by the Commons Committee, and he was given Vernon's seat. The pot had succeeded in calling the kettle black. Rich and distinguished families with parliamentary aspirations were caught in the web. The Harleys of Brampton Bryan were a family renowned for their parliamentarian stance in the Civil War. In 1710, the Harleys succeeded in getting their candidate elected for Bishop's Castle, but 8 years later, appalled by what they called the roguery and perfidy of the perfidious wretches, profligate wretches of Bishop's Castle, they sold the manor to the Earl of Carnarvon, later Duke of Chandos. As well as bribery and corruption, there were outbreaks of violence. In 1734, Robert Moore of Linley, standing as a Whig, was faced with a drunken mob, raised by John Walcott of Walcott, shouting, "Down with the Roundheads, damn Moore, down with him." Bishop's Castle seems to have been a quite unruly town to the extent that it was occasionally called Little Sodom. In 1837, it was said to have boasted 20 beer shops and no Sunday school. There was a whipping post near the town hall. When the artist Frederick Goodall, the romantic moral painter, observed a pathetic old man prayerfully begging for mercy when about to be flogged, he repainted the figure as a model of humility entitled Grace Before Meat. The old reprobate is said to have dined out very well on this for some time. Politically, Bishop's Castle had a capacity for producing electoral farce, matched only by the modern campaign slogan, "Relax, only one of them can win." In 1763, a set of fortuitous circumstances brought Robert Clive to Bishop's Castle, chasing new political opportunities. Back from India, and with immense wealth behind him, Clive was eager to build up his parliamentary support. The Walcott family of Lidbury North, who had for many years nominated members of Parliament for the borough, fell heavily into debt. This is hardly surprising, since in 1753, to elect their Bishop's Castle candidate, John Dashwood King, they had incurred, among other expenses, a bill for 1,781 gallons of ale and other liquors. Yes, 1,781 gallons of ale. Wow. John Walcott's son, Charles, was forced to sell the Walcott estate to the new kid on the block, who was Robert Clive. It went for £92,000. Almost immediately, Clive enlisted the eminent architect, Sir William Chambers, to rebuild the house, more or less as it looks today, a fine building. An ambitious gentleman wishing to achieve parliamentary power and influence had to achieve 4 interdependent objectives. He had to gather around him, in the House of Commons, a group of members who were his own personal nominations and who could be relied upon to give him loyal support. To do this, he should purchase properties within or close to the target area to enhance his local influence. Having done that, he had to study the political, in particular, local electoral scene, its practices and its malpractices. And finally, he needed the right friends in the right places at the right time. Such a campaign required the deployment of considerable amounts of money. On the 23rd of September that year, 1763, one of the sitting members for Bishop's Castle, Francis Child, died suddenly. Clive had not yet taken possession of his new estate, and he remarked with brutal frankness that Child had died rather sooner than I would have wished. He confessed himself almost an utter stranger to the borough. Nevertheless, he took swift and decisive action, moved into Walcott Hall, secured the support of Charles Walcott by promising him a seat in the next Parliament, and attempted to buy off the other candidate, William Walter Waring of Oldbury Sned. To that he offered £1,000. The bribery was unsuccessful, but Clive was able to get his cousin, George Clive, elected as a new member by 80 votes to 53. So, chameleon-like, Bishop's Castle changed its status from rotten borough to pocket borough. The Clive pocket would now control the scene for over 30 years. George Clive was propelled into Bishop's Castle's political cockpit. The fame and Indian wealth of his cousin Robert securing him an immediate seat. The family tightened its grip on the borough further in 1768, when Robert was able to engineer the election of his brother, William, to the second Bishop's Castle seat. This was in part ensured by paying £1,000 to Charles Walcott to be released from Clive's earlier promise of a seat. However, did the borough of Bishop's Castle remain under Clive control for over 30 years? But William Clive occupied one of the seats continuously for nearly 41 years, eventually becoming father of the House of Commons. The other seat was held by Clive nominees, often men of great distinction, including the Scottish lawyer Alexander Wedderburn, who ultimately became Lord Chancellor of England. Another one was the family secretary Henry Strachey, a baronet, MP for 2 periods in Bishop's Castle, who also held cabinet offices in Ordnance, the Treasury, and the Home Office. Opulence and power were clearly dictating electoral results. Our theme today is Georgians in stone. And I want to leave the parliamentary scene for a moment to consider a rather different historical role that came the way of Bishop's Castle and left a legacy in stone. At the beginning of the 19th century, Britain found herself at war with France, threatened by the ambitions of Napoleon Bonaparte. There was Nelson's victories at sea, culminating in Trafalgar in 1805, the Peninsular War from 1807 to 14 to protect our allied Portugal against French invasion, and finally, victory for Britain and her allies at Waterloo in 1815. Surprisingly, Bishop's Castle, remote from all these hostilities, found herself with a new and unusual role in the conflict. The treatment of prisoners of war has always been an unhappy and often unedifying aspect of war. In the 19th century, ordinary soldiers or sailors could expect harsh treatment and poor conditions. In Britain, being sent to prison ships, the hulks, moored in the river estuaries. For officers, however, considerably better conditions and more freedom were possible if they could get put on parole. This meant a solemn undertaking on their part to remain inactive in a defined location. Bishop's Castle found itself chosen as one of numerous parole towns, good distance from the sea, perhaps. It was allocated a number of prisoners to be billeted in hostelries or private houses. These men could fraternize with local inhabitants and were allowed freedom of movement within 1 mile of the town. There's a milestone on the road to the Lee, the turning point of what was called the Frenchman's Mile. To venture beyond this was to risk arrest. Research by the late Richard Rose indicates that there were some 57 French prisoners in the town, 9 of them billeted at the 6 Bells Inn. There are some 11 references to the French in the parish registers. One of them is to the burial of Mary Morgan, a shopkeeper who died on the 10th of December 1875, aged 85. Her gravestone records her as relict of the late Louis Pettit. In an entry, the 5th of November 1813, the church marriage register confirms marriage by license with consent of parents between Joseph Louis Maria Pettit, Lieutenant French Navy of the parish of Montgomery, another parole town, bachelor, and Mary Morgan, spinster. Witnesses Antoine Poudard, the mark of Margaret Davis, and William Farmer. The baptismal register of the 6th of March 1815, 15 months later, records the birth of Louis, child of Louis and Mary Hettet. Louis Hettet eventually returned to France. His son, Louis the Younger, followed him, but being an adventurous spirit, travelled on and on, finally to reach New Zealand. Here he befriended the Maoris and became a conciliator in the wars between the tribes and the British invaders. He married the daughter of a Maori chief and became a highly respected figure in the emerging nation. In November 2012, the proprietor of the 6 Bells in Bishop's Castle received an email inquiry from New Zealand about the Hettet family. SWSHAS, the History Society, took this up and corresponded with Louis's descendants, exchanging information about his remarkable life. In 2015, the town received 2 visits from New Zealand, John and Sybil Hettit, and later Robert and Awina Hettit. Robert gave a Maori address at the grave of Mary Morgan, thanking the community for respecting his ancestors and presenting a carved wooden ancestral plaque, a wahorara, now in the Bishop's Castle Heritage Resource Centre. Another noteworthy grave from the Napoleonic period bore a French inscription which translates as, "To the memory of Louis Page, Lieutenant Colonel of Light Horse, Knight of the Military Orders of the Two Sicilies and Spain, died in Bishop's Castle, 1st of May 1814, aged 40 years. Louis Page was born at Revel in Haute-Garonne in southwestern France. His family were Huguenots, Protestants, a denomination at one time much persecuted in a Catholic country. He had achieved considerable distinction as a high-ranking officer, serving in the Garde Royale under Napoleon's brother, Joseph, King of Spain. He was captured in the Battle of Vittoria on the 21st of June, 1813, and came to Bishop's Castle, but spent less than a year as a prisoner here. When his grave inscription became illegible due to weathering conditions, Church Warden Peter Norton arranged for a small plaque preserving the wording to be placed in front of a headstone. This spelt Louis's name Pace, P-A-C-E-S, but subsequent research confirms it as Page, P-A-G-E-S. In the Bishop's Castle Church Register, there are recorded in all 6 other marriages between French prisoners and local women, 5 baptisms, 2 children died in infancy, and 1 adult burial. One other very important stone dates from this period. This is a grave marked I.D., a native of Africa, who died in this town on 9th of September 1801. God has made of one blood all nations of men. The inscription, which was recorded with warm approbation in the Wolverhampton Chronicle in November 1850, poses interesting questions about slavery and the abolitionist movement. Sadly, it's not in my brief to discuss this here today. There was much unrest sweeping the country at this time. The Factory Act succeeded in reducing the hours which little children could be expected to toil in the mines and mills. But in the countryside, poverty was every bit as cruel as in the cities. Poet Oliver Goldsmith wrote in a poem called The Deserted Village, "Ill fares the land, to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. Princes and lords may flourish or may fade, a breath can make them as a breath has made. But a bold peasantry, their country's pride, when once destroyed, can never be supplied." In 1802, while Edward Clive was away in Madras, that bold peasantry, the Bishop's Castle electorate, saw a new opportunity to break the increasingly unpopular and repressive monopoly of representation by the Clive family. At the same time, they could increase their political income. The customary price of a vote was raised from £20 to £25, and new money was brought into play. London Hall in Bishop's Castle had been inherited by J.C. Kinshant of Park Hall, Whittington, who put up for election the wealthy Thomas Clark of Petlow in North Shropshire. But still, the Clives kept their grip on both seats. The opposition was getting desperate, as can be seen from a lively collection of election songs, jingles, squibs and posters from a marvellous collection in the Bishop's Castle Town Hall records, dating from January to February 1818. Most refer to the growing resistance to the Clive stranglehold. Let Clive and corruption together be driven from the borough wherein they have hitherto striven. Let Robinson, Clive, and the rest of them know that the lads of old Clark may yet strike a blow. They can send up a member to sit in the House who cares for the members less than louse, who never support any measures but those which give to the nation content and repose. Indulge every hope, dispel every fear. Corruption must vanish. Independence is near. Another song is even more outspoken about the effects of the political monopoly. It's called Starve Beggar, the Cause of All the Mischief, to the tune Moses and the Vicar. And I do hope very much one of these days to hear John Kirkpatrick singing it. At North Lidbury, you may plainly see old Staff Beggar and his young cub, since he came from his den to oversee men, gives them naught but a damn and a smug. Did the lordship but know that things went on so, I think he would alter the case, assist the poor men, drive this cub to his den, and put some good man in his place. Derry down, Derry, etc. Resolutions were passed unanimously by a numerous meeting of the town's Brydges, dated the 8th of January 1818, and they took a hard line. 1. That every free and independent Brydges has the right to keep the free possession of his vote till the day of electing his representative. 2. That any attempt to ensnare and bind men by promises procured by artifice and threats at the very moment when another candidate is daily expected, and that too at a period so distant before an election may take place, is an unjust attempt to deprive us of a substantial benefit of our vote. 3. That to persecute a man for the vote he may intend to give, or refuse to receive a vote after a particular day, is a still more unjust and cruel invasion of our rights. That, as it is for the interest of one and all the Burgesses to send to Parliament one man of their own choice, unconnected with any great neighbouring family, so we are resolved one and all to stand by and protect to our utmost any man who may have been threatened or in any way injured by their agents or dependents. 5. That for the security of our rights, therefore, for the interests of this borough and all its inhabitants, and for the sake of peace and good fellowship among us, we will unite one and all to name the Honourable Douglas Kinnaird as one of our representatives to the House of Commons, whilst we fully acquit ourselves of all obligations to the family of Clive by returning for the other seat one of its members. Douglas Kinnaird was a very colourful man with impressive credentials. Son of a Scottish peer, educated at Eton and Cambridge with banking interests, and a friend of poets Lord Byron and Sheridan. In the 1819 election, he achieved success, defeating the Clive nominee, Lord Valencia, by 87 votes to 83. But greater excitement was to follow. The veteran member William Clive retired before the 1820 general election, and a four-cornered election contest ensued. The Clive family candidates were Edward Rogers, a barrister and son of a Ludlow alderman, and William Holmes, the Tory chief whip. They were opposed by Douglas Kinnaird and Robert Knight, a Warwickshire squire. A vigorous campaign followed and resulted in an amazing result, each of the four candidates securing 87 votes. The Speaker of the House summoned the returning officer and town officials to London like naughty boys. Whereas, by an order of the House of Commons, the matter of the petition of the Honourable Douglas James William Kinnaird and Robert Knight, Esquire, complaining of an undue election and double return for the borough of Bishop's Castle, is appointed to be taken into consideration by the said House upon Tuesday the 30th day of May instant, at a quarter of an hour before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. These are therefore to require you, John Wollaston the younger, Thomas Jones, Robert Watson and George Beddoes, and each and every one of you, to be and appear at the bar of the House of Commons upon the said 30th day of May instant, as aforesaid, to receive and obey such further order as the said House or the select committee then to be appointed to try the matter of the said petition shall make concerning the same, as you will answer the contrary at your peril. Given unto my hand the 20th day of May 1820, Sir Charles Manners Sutton, Speaker of the House of Commons. The first parliamentary scrutiny gave the verdict to Kinnaird a night by a single vote, but a subsequent investigation of bribery reversed this verdict. The Clives had regained control, but the end was near. In the Reform Act of 1832, Bishop's Castle, with its population of less than 2,000, was disfranchised. The last Bishop's Castle MPs were James Knight and Edward Rogers. The members of the House were no doubt highly amused in the debate over the Act to hear one of Bishop's Castle's sitting MPs, James Knight, pleading that the town's electors were as free from improper bias as any in the kingdom, and that the only influence they acknowledged was that of kindliness. Our neighbours, the citizens of Clun, keen to rub salt into the wound, particularly as they had had no parliamentary representation, are said to have sent up a hot air balloon, which read on one side, "An enemy to corruption and nomination boroughs," and on the other side, "To the ex-Burgesses of Bishop's Castle." In 1885, Parliament replaced the last Burgesses by town councillors. A local rotten tree jug depicts a rotten tree propped up by bailiff and Burgesses, pleading that "you take away our lives when you take away the means whereby we live," which confirms the rueful remark of an earlier victim of the corruption: "The only occupation of the townsfolk is electioneering." Finally, what about the occupants of our listed tombs? John Home, J.B. Tolderby, Samuel Drew, William Hughes, Thomas Medlicott, Richard Griffiths, William Pole. Were they among our Burgesses, and where did they stand when elections came round? Did they accept the common practice of putting their votes on the market, or did they stand aloof from the roguery and perfidy, as one of their contemporaries, who rests in the northwest corner of the churchyard? Matthew Marston. He departed this life May the 29th, 1802, aged 81, the oldest Burgess of the borough. His steady and uncorrupt conduct presents an example to his brother Burgesses for perpetual imitation, and a useful lesson to the parliamentary representative of this borough, that opulence and power cannot alone secure independent suffrage. After more than 200 years of enjoying the opportunities of electioneering, Bishop's Castle seems to have slipped comfortably back to being a quiet place with interests centred not on politics, but on agriculture. In 1899, H.T. Timmins wrote in Nooks and Corners of Shropshire, "It is a place half town, half village, a drowsy little market town, yet proud withal of being the metropolis of an extensive agricultural district, renowned for its great cattle fair, frequented by breeders and men whose talk is of bullocks." Thank you.